Next up, we have Hester Steel and Alexandra Murphy here to talk about The Faceless Thing We Adore. Hester Steel is the queer debut author of The Faceless Thing We Adore. Originally from the UK, she has worked around the world as a freelance writer and English teacher. Her work has appeared in several small press and indie anthologies, including The Uncanny and the Dead. Hester currently lives in London. Alexandra Murphy is the editor behind Page Street Publishing's horror line. She is passionate about stories that are analogous to real-world issues, explore perspectives from around the world, and take experimental risks.
I'm so excited to be here with Hester Steel to present The Faceless Thing We Adore. So The Faceless Thing We Adore is a story as old as time. It's, you break up with your shitty boyfriend, you travel to a foreign country to find yourself, and then you end up in a sex-fueled commune worshiping an angry god. So, not quite the same tale, perhaps. And when this was originally pitched to me, and I won't spoil it, I'll let Hester give it away, but I just knew I had to have it. So why don't you tell everyone, Hester, how you came up with this idea and where it kind of originated in its like most basic form?
It came from a very silly little phrase that I just had rolling around in my head of like, because I was backpacking and I was in Thailand for a university thing. So I was like surrounded by backpackers and I was doing a bit of traveling myself. And just like the words that kept going through my head were Eat, Pray, Lovecraft. And I was just thinking like how funny it would be to me if one of these people like came traveling on a spiritual journey and ended up like worshiping an eldritch god. And then like it just dawned on me that there's a book there. And at first that it was going to be a comedy. And then as I dug more into it, I was like, no, this has a lot of potential as a horror. And that's what it ended up being.
Yeah, it is a book that I will say goes really hard. So to think that this started as a comedy, it just always makes me laugh. But Eat, Pray, Lovecraft, the second I saw that in my pitch queries, I was like, I have to have this. I don't care what it is. I know that you have talked about how like long this project has taken, and you said it's been through a lot of different drafts. And I'm curious, like, what do you think has been the most surprising as you've gone through every different iteration?
So I think what surprised me was, well, firstly, that it was started out as a comedy, went through a phase of the fantasy and eventually ended up as a horror. But I think what surprised me most was which stories came to the forefront in it, because initially it was written as like dual point of view and there was a whole other storyline. And that other storyline was actually the one that I thought was the central one. And Aoife was kind of a side character with a side arc. And then as I went through more and more drafts and as I showed it to more and more people, it started to become clear that it was Aoife's story and that it always should have been Aoife's story. And that was when I kind of started clicking with it, and I started clicking with the other characters in her storyline and realizing there was so much to explore there. And it just kind of, it grew from there. And I was just really surprised by Stephen characters coming into their own.
I think that's so great. One of the things that I love the most about your book is I think that like horror in general is just this really great genre. And I know, as Emily said, it's having a moment and we're seeing it. And is it indicative of the horrors that we're experiencing in real life? Probably. And I think that horror is its best when it is pulling from our real life terrors. And this is a book that does talk about cults and it talks about, toxic relationships and gaslighting. And I'm just kind of curious, like, as you were writing this book, what kind of research did you do? Were there books that you were reading or podcasts listening to and different things like that for inspiration?
I think, yeah, like mostly I was focusing my research on like history and psychology of cults. And there are a vast amount of cult themed podcasts out there. I was completely stunned by how many people have put so much time into researching cults. And a lot of it was very sensationalist and very true crime, but there was also some really fascinating stuff that sort of dug into the experiences of people who got caught up in cults. I think there was Haruki Murakami's Underground, which studied the experiences of the people who survived and also who were involved with the cult that committed the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo. And that was fascinating and disturbing at times to read. And also there was a podcast on the cult Heaven Gate, which again, like got into the experiences of the followers of the cults. And it just felt very humanizing to hear people's stories that have been involved with that, and how identifiable a lot of their logics were.
I think it's something you do so well in this book is that you take something that is so clear cut in our brains as a society, like the word cult, automatically you conjure up these negative connotations. And yet somehow when you're reading this book and you're connecting to all these characters, it just feels almost normalized and feels very human. And it really takes the perspective from the members in a way that is like, oh, I can see how someone would end up in this kind of situation. Um, so I love how human this book feels. And I'm just curious, like, as you went through this, like, is there anything that you hope that readers are taking away from this as they experience this very human novel?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things that I hope people are taking away from it. And the first one is, that you can be in an absolutely horrific situation, and hopefully there are always ways to retain some humanity. I think there was a scene, like we were talking about this, that surprised me. There was a scene that I wrote where the people involved have just done something absolutely horrific to people that they care very much about, that they've been pushed to this point. And then they kind of like, there's a moment where they understand what they've done, and they're sort of turning around that ritualistic approach that they've had to then, there's no way to make it right, but to express their guilt and to express that there is something of them that's still surviving and something of them that's still resisting. And I didn't expect them to do that. And I was just sort of watching them doing that as I was talking, like, oh, okay, wow. And I think like there's various different ways that various different characters retain themselves. And that's one thing that I want people to take away. And I think the other thing is just, particularly with Aoife's story, but I think also with Kira's, the love interest, the main love interest, and Miri, who's basically a child in this situation, that the things that are their greatest weaknesses become their greatest strengths, and what it takes for them to survive. And I think that's something that always gets me in stories, and that's something that always gets me in real life when, the things that you've been through in life are what then pushes you to push back against situations you find yourself in.
Yeah, I think that despite this book getting dark and despite it being in the horror, there's so much heart and so much hope in this book. And I think there's a lot of like understanding how to be pushed past your humanity and then finding it again. And I think that's really something that we can all use in our life right now. um, and despite, you know, you have this very large cast of characters. And I remember when I first read this manuscript, I was like, we have to cut some of these. It's characters. I can't follow them all. And then every time we would go through the revision process, I was like, but everyone's just so dang good. I can't find any reason to cut someone. Just for anyone who, loves to write or is curious about, balancing a large cast of characters, what advice do you have for making your book feel so well-rounded and every character feeling so alive and real?
I think like, firstly, it's spreadsheets. There were several drafts that I went through where I had to list out all of the scenes and list out all of the characters and be like, okay, this person appears here and here and here and here and here. There's this whole gap where they don't appear. Everyone's going to forget who they are. So there was a lot of going through that to make sure that everyone got their moment. But also it's amazing how one character can grow from one small detail. And so I just for example, I had one character, just a side character who's, she's, I mentioned in past that she learned to fire spin at a circus. And then I was like, oh, okay, well now she feels vivid and real to me. And and then they start again to act on their own accord, and you start to get to know them as people. And then it's very hard not to include them.
It's so funny to think of writing in spreadsheets. I consider them two separate things, but it makes sense. And obviously it worked out because all of your characters feel incredibly real and alive, and they don't feel like they drop off the place. Just to wrap it up, what's the last two quick questions? The first one, do you have a favorite line? No context. From the book.
I do have a favorite line. It is 2 words. Basically during, I think the final or second to last round of edits, there was a scene that I came to that I'd been struggling with from the beginning. It was very big, very epic, very cosmic horror, very you've passed the point of this being a psychological horror. You've moved fully into this being a cosmic horror. Um, and it never quite felt right. And I just tried as an experiment, deleting the entire scene and replacing it with the words "fuck that," and suddenly it worked. So my favorite line is probably "fuck that," which actually echoes something that a character says is a pivotal moment before that. And it feels right. It comes together there. So I guess that's my favorite phrase.
Well, you know what? I think that's a perfect to say less is more. So I actually will leave it at that last question. Thank you so much, everyone who came in to this panel to listen. I can't wait to hear about our final book, and I will pass it back to Emily.
Thank you so much, Hester and Alexandra. That was delightful. I am going to try the next time I'm struggling with a scene, just replacing it with the words "fuck that." That sounds wonderful.